They came together to make this book, I guess, as a pushback against their own PTSD of having covered so much violence, so much war, so much carnage. And rather than just leave well enough alone and sail off to a happy retirement, these two folks have put together an international foundation to try to teach journalism and photography skills to young people from all over the world, which we will be talking about, as their way of striking a blow for democracy and freedom. Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer. You are on my Facebook page with me and two authors who are friends of mine, Gary Knight and Fiona Turner. There's all sorts of stuff up on the page about their book, but I'm going to hold it up. And it is Imagine Reflections on Peace. Gary is a world-renowned photographer and journalist. Fiona is a world-renowned journalist who did all sorts of things we're going to ask her about. They came together to make this book, I guess, as a pushback against their own PTSD of having covered so much violence, so much war, so much carnage. And rather than just leave well enough alone and sail off to a happy retirement, these two folks have put together an international foundation to try to teach journalism and photography skills to young people from all over the world, which we will be talking about, as their way of striking a blow for democracy and freedom. So I admire Gary and Fiona as much as I admire anybody. And I have read this book cover to cover. I have many underlined passages in it. And I'm just going to start before I introduce them by reading you a quote, which I think sets up this book very well by Gary in the foreword. Violence is graphic and describable, peace more of an elusive ideal, an ephemeral space between wars, a pause both an aftermath to war and a prelude to yet another war. As long as we celebrate warriors more than peacemakers, as long as we insist fiercely on our differences rather than humbly seeking our commonalities, peace will be framed in the context of war as an abundance of something rather than as a presence. And then a couple pages on, as the major world powers look inward, fighting political battles at home and struggling to rebuild broken economies, the appetite for solving problems far from home may diminish. And so that sort of sets up the problem. Now, what this book does, and they will tell you about it and we'll talk about it, is it's not a series only of essays by peacemakers, some of them very famous world leaders, political leaders and others in places like Northern Ireland and Sarajevo, Colombia, etc., but also photo essays of the kind of before and after wartime and then peacemaking. So once again, Imagine Reflections on Peace. So welcome, Gary. Welcome, Fiona. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. We will be open to some questions, which I'll try to get to as they come in and pass on to Gary and Fiona. But for the moment, Fiona, why don't I just start with you? Kind of something personal here. You and Gary have been together for a while. How did you all meet when he was doing photography and you were doing journalism?
Well, first of all, Frank, thanks very much for having us here. It's
Sure.
Yeah, so Gary and I met nearly 3 decades ago in the early 90s, and we met covering a war. We met in Bosnia. I was fortunate at that time. I sort of was just entering into my professional life as a broadcast producer for ABC News. And that took me to a lot of places. And it was a really fascinating period of time because the world was changing. We just seen the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall had come down, and I spent the first few years of the from late 1989 to the early 90s, covering all of those different countries in what we used to know as Eastern Europe, and seeing those radical changes and the shock and sort of amazement and surprise and elation and confusion as democracy started to take hold. And I was working for ABC News, and I had been in the war in Croatia for a while. in 91, and then the war moved to Bosnia, and I was there in 92, and it wasn't until 93 that I was on the edge of a front line, and I was driving with my fixer, and we crossed the front line, and they came under a lot of shelling, and then I noticed there was a car behind us, and both cars stopped as soon as we could, and the guy who got out from the car behind was Gary, who's now my husband. So
that's great. Good story, and pretty dramatic setting to meet somebody. Now, Gary, I won't get you to retell the whole story, but where were you in your career the day you met Fiona and got out of that car and came under shell fire? What's the trajectory of your career, sort of thumbnail sketch as a photographer? And we'll get to the rest in a bit. You know, you've been a journalist for a long time. You've been everywhere. Where were you kind of on that path when you met Fiona?
I was right at the beginning of my career, Frank. So I had gone over to Southeast Asia in 1988 and started working there ostensibly because it was a very inexpensive place to live. I was based in Thailand. I lived in a youth hostel, and I could get on a bus and go to the Cambodian border or the Burmese border and photograph both those countries. And it wasn't a sort of huge news story in either country at the time. And so the competition from the sort of more established photographers wasn't too great. And there were a lot of young photographers and journalists based there at the time. And I spent 4 years there really cutting my teeth and learning the craft. And Bosnia was really where I went when I sort of felt that I had a little bit of knowledge. But in fact, when I arrived there, I realized how you know, naive I was. Actually, I'd never confronted anything quite like the conflict in Bosnia, which so I'd only covered, you know, guerrilla wars up until that point, but Bosnia was really, you know, very intense war, a lot of artillery, and huge, you know, issue of crimes against humanity, war crimes. So that was a lot
of which, by the way, of course, is recapped in the book. So you bring a lot of your knowledge, and I guess you met some of the folks who show up in the book as you covered some of these conflicts, both of you, right, Fiona, right, Gary? I mean, some of these guys go back into those conflicts. Did you meet some of these people on the ground, follow them later? You know, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, all of this. You've got this incredible cast of people, and I'm not going to waste the time reading who they all are, but I can just assure you that the people you knew, the people who contributed to this book are kind of a who's who of international diplomacy. Did you meet these people after you both became well known in the news business and got in touch with them, or did you kind of pick these contacts up on the ground as you were getting shelled in various places and meeting your wife and your husband and all the rest of it?
It was should I have a stab at that one for you? It was a mix, actually, Frank. So, for example, Samantha Power, Ambassador Power, I met, in fact, when she had just graduated from law school. So she was in her early 20s and came out to Sarajevo as a journalist. So she was right at the beginning of her career, as was I. And at the time, actually, we used to joke that if she had been born in America, she would certainly be the first female president of the United States. But she was a very, very impressive character at that time. Ron Haviv, my colleague at Seven, was a little more established than I was. Anthony Lloyd had just left the British Army and was building his career in Bosnia. And John Swain, I met when I started my career in Cambodia, actually. He was incredibly generous with me and helped me really kickstart my career, and he used to come in from Hong Kong and feed me. I was so poor. So many of these relationships were built when Fiona and I were in Bosnia in the early 90s.
And Fiona, when you were out covering these stories, you know, I introduced you both as sort of, you know, heavy-hitting journalists, and you're both very modest, so you're talking about your beginnings. But Gary, you wound up doing some stuff, and Fiona, you were Peter Jennings' producer somewhere, and then you were in London in that office doing stuff for many years. So essentially, the scope of your experience in the news business is transatlantic and global, correct? I mean, I'm not exaggerating that, and I think both of you bring that perspective to the book and also to our discussion here.
Yeah, I worked. I was based out of the London bureau. That's where I joined ABC News. But you know, London for Americans back then, that was just literally the hub. So we would travel, and you know, personally, it was the most fantastic experience and opportunity for me because I was watching history unfold in all of these places. I spent the best part of 20 years doing that. And on the way, you know, I was lucky enough to work with real professionals. Peter Jennings was the ABC anchor at the time. And he was as slick and as accomplished and as professional as they come. A true old school journalist. And it was a pleasure to work with him. So yeah, I mean, we were traveling all the time, and I was meeting people along the way. As you said, a lot of the people in the book we met at that time, and of course, you know, the more people you know, the more doors are open. So, for instance, when we were putting this together and we were looking for people, I reached out.
I think, you know, when you're talking to you and Gary, you talk to most people the old 6 degrees of separation, but I think with both of you, as I ran through this book and was reminded, because I'm a pretty avid newsreader and have been since I was a kid, but you know, you forget names, but it was a who's who of people who essentially shaped world history in the last 30 or 40 years. It's really an amazing book, that even just that way, of the people that you've had personal contact with in covering and so on. Let me just remind folks here who are watching that I'm talking with Gary Knight, world-renowned war photographer and correspondent, and his wife, Fiona Turner, who have made this incredible book, Imagine Reflections on Peace, which they draw from their own experience. At the beginning of this show, Gary and Fiona, jump in however you want, I kind of described you as having done this book as an alternative to simply suffering the PTSD of witnessing so much suffering in a way and carnage. You know, as a layman who has not covered wars, but I did have a Marine fight in Afghanistan, so a little bit of a touch of that sorrow and worry. I've always imagined someone like you, Gary, having a hard time sometimes getting the ringing out of your ears. You know, when you look through these essays and there are people being killed and evidence of torture and so forth, did it come as a relief to both of you? And I'd like you both to answer this in whatever order, to be able to put that dark energy, that experience, into something where you are not just calling for peace in some nice wishy-washy way, but actually analyzing the anatomy of where peacemaking has been successful with all its messiness and where it has failed, trying to instruct from what you've seen. Did you come at that from a point of view of kind of your own therapy in a way to do something positive with these experiences? Fiona, does that make any sense, or am I just putting words in your mouth?
Yes, it does. My experience is slightly different, guys, because, you know, working for the networks, you do have that security of knowing that they're always going to get you out or do their best to get you out of a bad situation. I think it's always the cameramen and the photographers who are witnessing those really dramatic moments. Everybody else, you know, is sort of behind the lines a little bit. So the quite is great, but you know, this is really Gary's baby, and he carried the weight of everything that he had seen.
Yeah, I understand. And so, Gary, you know, coming to you for a minute, you know, did what I say made sense in the sense that, you know, you've taken this experience and you're trying to do something positive, but actually do more than something positive. You're trying to contribute to the sort of reconciliation process that we've seen in some countries and not in others after civil wars, for instance. Talk a little bit about your own motivation in doing this project, but then also some of the instances we see in the book that have been more successful: forgiveness, reconciliation, and all these other things that we've seen in Africa and other parts of the world where people have tried to do this. Can you just take us through some of the content?
Sure. In 2003, I was involved in the invasion of Iraq, as I write about a little in the introduction. And, you know, I think that's fair to say that wasn't perhaps the worst thing I think I ever saw in war, but it was really the most violent, and the intensity of violence was quite incredible. And when I came back from that experience, Fiona and I were living in France, in this very pastoral area down in the south of France, and I drove out of Baghdad, and the same in the morning, and then I think that night I flew back to Europe. And when I got home, I was really in a state of sort of shock. Actually, I'd been living a bit like an animal in Iraq, going in with the Marines, and I was reflecting on the violence, and I was exhausted by the violence, Frank, to be quite honest with you. I didn't want to experience that anymore. I'd been doing so for about 15 years, 16 years at that point, and I was really exhausted by it. And Fiona and I had 2 young children. So for me, I felt that was really the beginning of the end of my career as a war photographer. It took another 3 or 4 years to extract. But I also started to think, about my role as a journalist and the way my pictures had been used. And just being an eyewitness to a conflict and showing other people outside what it's like and what the experience is like somehow didn't really seem to be enough for me. And I started to think about this idea of, peace. It is this brilliant, beautiful, noble idea that we struggle, even as you read at the beginning, to define.
Yeah.
And I thought, it would be, if this is the ideal, when I'm going through a war experience, when civilians are living through a war experience, when soldiers and Marines are going through a war experience, we imagine that peace will come in the end. But I thought it would be really useful to try and understand what peace actually looked like.
Yeah.
It isn't people releasing doves into the air. And the more I started to think about all the wars that I had covered, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, etc., I realized that peace actually hadn't really delivered what we and the civilians who had lived through war had expected or even deserved. And I thought that it would be very useful to analyze, what had worked, what we had got right as societies, and where we had failed.
Yeah.
And it took, from 2003 until 2 or 3 years ago to assemble all the work. But in the end, it was a very, very interesting experience, actually, because I think that some of the assumptions that we made as authors and some of the assumptions that we as societies make, can be challenged. And I think you see that in this book. And for example, if you take Rwanda and Cambodia, those countries that are run by dictators, effectively, one country has been more successful than the other, and that's Rwanda. Even though the political situation there is very complex and very dark, it is a country that has made, I think, a more successful peace than Cambodia. So the question is why? When you examine Rwanda and Northern Ireland, for example, you see that the presence of women, both in the process of making peace and in the running of a country, is essential to making peace. And countries like Bosnia that exclude women have a less successful peace. So some of the things that we found were really quite surprising. Some were obvious, the role of justice. As you see in America, with the Chauvin trial, justice is critical in creating a peaceful and more stable society. Truth and reconciliation, as the South Africans learned and was applied in Rwanda, also very critical. So as a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, and Fiona, before moving on, let me just remind everybody that, we're talking about your book, and I keep holding it up, Imagine Reflections on Peace. And you were both journalist, photographer, and so forth. Having put this book together and designed it, Fiona, as well as edited and contributed an essay and other material to it, if you were if I was a diplomat trying to put together a peace deal for somebody working for the US State Department on my way back and forth to Northern Ireland 20 years ago, or whatever it would have been, or Rwanda or Cambodia, aside from the fact that if women aren't involved, peace doesn't happen anywhere very much. What pointers, having edited this book, you say, look, here are the 3 things you should always do, and watch out for this, don't ever do that. I don't want to limit you to 4 points, but what do you take away as a message to peacemakers? And I just want to say one thing here, because it seems to me, having read this book, that this applies not only in international situations, but you brought up the idea, the whole issue of police brutality in Minneapolis and murdering Black folks by American cops and this kind of thing. It seems that in America, we have vastly alienated communities who are in a virtual, if not hot, civil war with each other over cultural issues, as well as race. So these questions don't just apply to some far off foreign context. They're right here at home in the US in terms of trying to put the pieces back together after, for instance, the storming of our own Capitol building, which, by the way, begins to look like it's on foreign soil. It's the kind of thing you read about happening in your book in some other country. Now it's happening here. So what are the broad stroke lessons, Fiona? And then Gary, jump in if you like, that you all would say, okay, guys, if you wanted to put the Humpty Dumpty back together again, and whether it's Bosnia or somewhere else, what works, what fails? Give us some pointers.
Okay, so I would look first to the lessons that Johnson Powell lays out. He was the UK chief negotiator for Tony Blair for the Northern Ireland peace talks. And he writes a chapter called Building the Tunnel. And I think that is, that to me was a real eye-opener, because what he was saying in there, he was completely, I really applaud him for his honesty and his candor. Because what he was revealing was what all of the politicians deny publicly. And that is that to have any chance of peace, you cannot stand on a soapbox and say you will refuse to speak to your adversary. You have to be open to discussion, and that involves trust. He actually, before I go on to what he was saying, but one of the funny things that his anecdote, that he was looking back in the Parliament, and John Major was the British Prime Minister at the time, and he stood up in the Parliament and said that he would never speak to Gerry Adams, and that it would turn his stomach to do so. And yet, at exactly the same time, he was corresponding with Martin McGuinness, who was the leader of the IRA. So it was completely hypocritical, but it was totally necessary.
Yeah.
And you can't show all your cards in leadership, and you do have to make that sort of to leap. And it's the what Johnson Powell then goes on to explain, it's building trust, and that is absolutely imperative if you're going to get anywhere. So you open a discussion, and then you have to show trust, and trust isn't defined by insisting that your adversary come to your territory. Trust is shown by going to theirs. And he gives a couple of examples of when he was blindfolded, taken in a taxi in Belfast at the invitation of the IRA, had no idea where he was going, had no connection with anybody else at the time, and then was, kicked out of the door. And the door opens on this very ordinary housing estate, and he's invited in for tea and sandwiches by Martin McGuinness. And he was completely vulnerable. And, I think that the lesson of that is that to engage with our enemy, we have to be able to both trust them and for them to trust us. We have to
and also, according to what you just said and what I've been reading in the book, be willing to put, to a certain extent, our life on the line, because in some of these situations, you might not come back. So the trust has not been verified yet. You are taking a step of faith as well, as I read it.
A complete step of faith, totally.
Yeah, and putting priority on peace enough so you're willing to risk your life for it.
Yeah, I think you get into it gradually, I guess. But yes, I mean, at some point you've got to dive in there. Otherwise.
Yeah. And Gary, in looking at the book and the process, can you give a similarly lucid, tough act to follow your wife there, articulate? If you can follow Fiona and give me just as lucid a thumbnail of what you might call, here's what you do if you really want your peace process to fail and nothing to work. Give me the downside, because there's also the record here in the book of so many things that haven't worked out, whether it's corruption or whatever. But she's given me a good prescription for how to start peacemaking. You tell me how to make sure it fails.
I think, I would say, if we try and impose peace on a society from the outside, force big players, America, China, Europe, try and force peace on a warring country, it is likely to fail. And I think to a certain extent, you can see that in Bosnia. Really, it has it was an imposed peace in many extent. The war on the ground was changing. The Bosnians, for the first time in the war, were becoming more powerful. And peace came to Bosnia when nobody had won and nobody had lost. Nobody had to feel that they needed to ask or request forgiveness. And I think if you impose peace, it's very controversial, of course, because the opposite of imposing peace is letting a war continue. But one has to be very careful. The desire for peace, as in Northern Ireland, really needs to come from within for it to be successful. And that's, I think, the condition that you need to create if you are an outside actor. It is to try and nurture the desire for peace from the inside.
I'm talking to Gary Knight and Fiona Turner. Fiona worked at the top of ABC News for a while in London with people like Peter Jennings and others, and Gary, an international war correspondent photographer for people like Newsweek, etc. And the book is Imagine Reflections on Peace. There are parts of this book that drew tears from my eyes. And one of the reasons why is it's so easy to make the jump as an American who has been politically involved myself into saying that our own democracy has become so fragile, with the Republican Party trying to introduce a kind of a new Jim Crow and keep people from voting who might not elect their folks, to the gerrymandering, to the storming of our Capitol, to 4 years of Donald Trump. The tough thing for me as an American reading this book is that so much of your story did not seem like it was taking place in a foreign country with people getting shot for their beliefs and these other things. It seemed much closer to home than it would have, say, 20 years ago, when American normality, taking for granted a democracy, had not begun to unravel. But when you have a major party has been taken over by an evangelical group of believers who are fundamentalist fanatics, very much like the fanatics on both sides of so many of the conflicts you portray, religious or secular, this cuts really close to home. So asking you both, I don't want to put you on the spot, it's a little awkward, to sort of play a de Tocqueville here. You're not speaking with American accents, but you've been here a long time and you've seen the world. How, given your experience reflected in Imagine Reflections on Peace, are you reading what is clearly a move away from being able to take democracy itself, or even recently an orderly, peaceful transition of power at the presidential level for granted? Surely, as foreign folks who've come to America, maybe back in the day, assuming it, you could kind of count on American democracy, if not much else. How have the last few years struck you in view of what you know about how international situations have disintegrated so fast, almost overnight in certain places? Because for me, it worries me. And I'm just asking, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just how's that point of view shaped?
Gary, do you want to go?
Sure. I think, in many of these countries, Frank, Bosnia, for example, it wasn't until the war actually started and the gunfire started in the streets that many people accepted that they had arrived as a situation where war was inevitable, right up until the last moment. I think as humans, it's human nature to imagine that this won't happen to us. And I'm not going to suggest that America is on the brink of a civil war right now. I might have thought that actually about a year ago, but I think there are some really significant divisions in America that need to be addressed. And that's one of the things you learn in this book. You know, enemies have to be able, they have to find the courage to sit down opposite each other at a table and find a solution for the betterment of everybody. And I think here in America, the issue of racial inequality is massive. And, you know, it's tempting after the the jury result in Minneapolis 2 days ago to think that things are going to get better, and I sincerely hope that they do. But I think the issue of race in America is really still very unresolved and needs to be tackled. And I think that this might be a bit controversial. I think there's a although I don't feel it where I live here in Massachusetts, I think there's a sort of lack of communality in America. I don't think there is a sort of seems to be a common project in America. I think America is incredibly divided, and political forces and community leaders in America need to start working very, very hard and very, very fast to bring people together, because this is a giant country. It isn't, in my view, terribly coherent. And, you know, looking from the outside, although I am sort of partially an insider, it is not implausible to think that it could explode or implode.
Yeah, and it seems to me too, and Fiona, weigh in here on what I'm saying. You know, it seems to me that in addition to which here we have the incredible racial tension going back into our history, very much with us now. And of course, it goes far beyond individual police officers gunning down Black people or brown people or asphyxiating them with their knee for 9 minutes plus. You know, it's every single traffic stop where I, as a white upper middle class American, get treated differently than someone brown, even if it's no more than just incessant rudeness that they face and threat. So it comes in a myriad of ways. But it also seems to me that when you have a country in which multi-billionaires approaching trillions in personal wealth, a handful of these people, you know, are concentrating on building their own private empires and running their own space programs and so forth, and yet at the same time arguing whether, in the case of Amazon, you can, you know, your folks can join a labor union and you feel you've been munificent by giving them $15 an hour, as Bezos does, and so on. I think there's also a social tension that could be as serious as our racial tension, with the economic disparity that is just massively growing. And, you know, one example, when you look at the difference in pay between the top executives in American corporations, even like General Motors, just 20, 30 years ago, and the lowest paid worker, say the part-time janitor, you know, it was still on a scale of dozens or hundreds of times. And now it's thousands and tens of thousands of times more that, say, the chairman of Disney earns against somebody just working in the park at a hamburger stand in Disneyland. I just think that that's another element to American culture right now. And then the third thing you throw in between race and this is that the US, in terms of Western democracies, is the only country outside of, say, Northern Ireland, but that's not one, you know, in the same category of size and so on. You know, then you kind of get into my bailiwick a little bit in analyzing the power of the evangelical right. You know, we have 60 million Americans who essentially don't see America through the eyes of any kind of facticity, because it's all a theological construct that says, well, Trump was given to us by God, Jesus is coming back soon, move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to hasten the return of Christ. Stuff that, you know, your average European sitting in London reading the Daily Mail or something is not going to usually get. You know, be on the working class side or on the upper class side, you know, maybe in New York, the editors of the New York Times. So, you know, I see the tension in the country being race, economic disparity, and then this huge sleeping time bomb that the secular media doesn't want to cover, which is, you know, we've got one whole party has been taken over by a fanatical fundamentalist wing of Christianity that is essentially envisaging a theocracy of the best of all worlds. I don't know if all that makes any sense to you, or how you see that relating to some of the countries you call you cover in Imagine Reflections on Peace, but I see it very related. And when I read your book, these things came to my mind for this country.
Yeah, it is related. And I think when we started off, we came to this idea a long time ago and started reporting on it 3 years ago when it, and the more we worked on it, the more relevant what was happening here in America appeared to relate to the stories in the book. I mean, I think one of the things that we need, and we're in a different place now than last year, is we have to look to leadership. I think strong leadership is really imperative in finding a way forward. And it was very interesting. I mean, looking at the examples of Bosnia and Rwanda, Bosnia had a very democratic leadership. Their constitution was basically written by Richard Holbrooke in Dayton and the cohort there. So it was based on this sort of Americanization of democracy. Everybody has a fair share. Actually, we don't have to go into it all now, but by creating that, it created a situation where basically nothing could move. Everything was completely petrified. Rwanda, you had this basically totalitarian dictatorship, but at his core were the interests of solving the problems of the nation. Kagame has gone forward and done some things which are very interesting. He determined that it was actually illegal to call out a Hutu or a Tutsi by their ethnicity. Everybody was Rwandan. Well, that's basically taking away, some people would argue that's taking away freedom of speech. And that's one of the issues that we have here, that, freedom of speech, freedom to be outrageous, freedom to basically incite violence. Look at it, is tolerated and supported. And I think that in a level of society, there are some freedoms we have to do without for the greater good of the larger. So I would look to that, and the same thing. Gary and I are both American citizens now, but our background is European, which is where our political thinking developed. And it's kind of hard. The tax system here is very hard for me to understand. I have no idea why corporations aren't paying tax, why they have all of these tax breaks. Like, what is that about? Basically they are supported by the men and women who are working what is now recognized as essential jobs, and for absolute basic minimum wage, and paying tax on that.
How's that work? And in addition, and it goes even further than that, because America's social safety net, thin as it is, supplements Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's workers and others like that by doing things like Medicaid, food stamps, and other things. Otherwise, these folks would be even more impoverished. So the picture is ameliorated by a government that spends some money on social welfare, a lot of which is not going to indigent people who aren't working or homeless, is going to the working poor and making the difference between literally being hungry all the time and just some of the time when working for vast corporations, where the people at the top are not just making a salary, they're making billions of excess financial gain. And then a lot of that they're not paying for. And so I think the social tension that comes burbling up out of that, in addition to the violence that is perpetrated against Black and brown people in this country by our law enforcement and the society in general, when you put those two things together, you've got a real nightmare. When you add in the fact that there's a group of people in this country who have taken over one of the parties, and that's the Republican Party, who essentially were groomed from birth to deny the facticity of a baseline of fact, whether it's evolution or global warming, whatever it may be. They see all that as fake news. And of course, we know who cashed in on that. So I'm in no way a doomsayer, but I think we would do better. And one reason I like your book, Imagine Reflections on Peace, so much is it's not a sort of a rosy picture of optimistic, this is how peace works. You have as much in this book about how peace doesn't work as in false starts and failures Bosnia, these places where they've never managed to really put it together properly. In other words, the war stopped, but you can't say they've got peace in the democratic sense that we would hope for. So in looking at how to resolve issues here in the US, I'm quite optimistic right now because I think Joe Biden's a really good president. He's being very bold. The Democrats have got a little margin here to work with, not much. But I think if it all bounces the other way, and in 2024 we get another Republican who's a smoother version of Trump, and with the gerrymandering and the voter suppression, we face another round of this. I think at that point, we'll be leafing through your book, Imagine Reflections on Peace, and looking for hints about how close we are to our own kind of more cataclysmic situation. And I don't think that's alarmist, and I don't think we'll get there. I think the Democrats are going to dig us out of this. I really believe that. I'm not a pessimist, but it seems to me that your book would always be relevant at any time of history, but just weirdly right now, it's particularly apt for our American moment. Do you agree with that, Gary?
Yeah, and just going back to your point, for me, there is a connection between, rampant capitalism, which has sort of become almost a religion in America, right? Yeah. I'm not anti, capital, but I think there is a connection between, income inequality, rampant capitalism, racism, endemic systemic racism, which exists here everywhere, in education, in the interactions with the police, in the military, in government, everywhere. And it's not just African Americans who are subjugated by that. It's Native Americans. It's all people of color, and the sort of dogma of religion and the presence of religion in politics. I don't think America really truly is actually a secular society in a sense. I think religion plays too much of a fundamental role. Yeah, and I know again, it's not meant to be offensive, and it might be unpopular here. But when I hear American presidents asking for God to bless America, as a European, I find that really jarring and uncomfortable. And because I don't think that religion should be playing a role in political life. I think religion is a wonderful thing. It can be a wonderful thing. But I think in America, it's become part of the problem. And, I think, people of color are excluded from playing in the economy as much as many other members of society. I think income inequality hits minorities much worse than it hits anybody else. I think religion is used by the Republican Party in a very oppressive, uncomfortable way. And these divisions are really, really important, and they can't be overlooked. And if you look at Cambodia, for example, back in the 1970s, if you go to Cambodia now, Cambodian people are very, on the surface, very, very lovely, very mellow, very devout, very religious people. It's a very pleasant, place to be, as is Thailand. But it didn't take much more than massive income inequality and resentment at living, lives in such poverty in Cambodia for the Khmer Rouge to appear. They didn't come out of nowhere. You had very privileged people living in cities and a very privileged ruling elite, and you had absolute devastation in the countryside where Cambodia was being bombed by the Americans, and people were struggling to survive, and people became very violent. And so, you want to be very, very, I'm not suggesting America is about to become Cambodia, but it doesn't take much to spiral out of control. Yeah. And I think that America last year was closer to that than it perhaps likes to imagine.
Yeah, I agree. Now, before we run out of time here, I'd like to move on something else. I'm very impressed with this foundation you all put together. I know you have a center in Arles in France and one in Bahrain, I believe, and
Bosnia.
Make this clear what you do, but also part of your initiative goes way beyond this book. It goes to a foundation where, if I understand it correctly, you are teaching photography, journalism, and the values of reporting honestly and fairly on things Can you just talk a little bit about what this foundation does, how people can get in touch with you and what all this is about? Because I just think it's a tremendous idea, and what it's called, who you are, as if I know nothing about it. Just tell me about this foundation for a couple minutes here.
Sure. So the foundation and the academy both have the name Seven, and Seven is spelled VII, so it's the Roman spelling. It confuses many people. So online you can find them at Seven Academy, Seven Foundation. The foundation, enterprises projects like the book, so long form storytelling projects, solutions-based journalism, looking at issues like food insecurity. Fiona made a film called Eat Up, looking at food insecurity in Boston in public schools. We might be trying to look at issues like making better peace processes in the world, environmental issues, etc. The Seven Academy was established to democratize journalism, really, and it provides a tuition-free education in journalism to men and women from the majority world, so Africa, Asia, Latin America, for example, and also men and women from less privileged communities in Europe and in the United States. We have
How long would they go? How long would you train these folks for? And when they leave, in the best case scenario, what do they do?
So the training currently, we've just started. So what we're trying to do is offer different layers of education. So at the moment, we've got a basic level of education, and these are 12-week-long courses. And you have to enter at that level. Once you've passed through that, you will go into a second intermediate course. Then there will be a third course, which will take place in one of our two physical locations. One is in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and one, as you say, is in Arles. We also then, the next phase is we provide scholarships for a small number of the best students to go and study master's degrees at London College of Communication. So they can then get a final degree and teach journalism and media practice in their own countries. And we offer scholarships to the Danish School of Journalism, which is one of the leading journalism schools in the world, where students can go and teach. And the last phase, which we're actually implementing over the next few weeks, is we're creating a program for our former students and others to be mentored through the Seven Photo Agency after they've been in media practice in the commercial world for 3 or 4 years. They'll be able to come inside the Seven Photo Agency and be mentored. And we hope that in a decade there will be a very, very strong group of media practitioners in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, and in communities in the States and Europe that are underrepresented, who can, confront significant issues that affect them, rather than having people like Fiona and I, go in from the outside and try and tell their stories. We want the stories to come from within these.
It just seems to me like a tremendously important thing you're doing.
Thank you.
In the sense that I can't imagine any peace process or anything good coming out of any moment of world history these days unless people have truthful information about the situation. I mean, that seems like the starting point of everything, is the reporting. So I don't think it's coincidental that you have kind of a global rise of authoritarianism combined with a lot of anti-media, anti-press activity, starting with Donald Trump saying it's all fake news and basically daring his mobs to beat up journalists. So the context in which you're doing this, whether it's what's going on in Europe or Africa or other places, seems to me that by training younger journalists, you are actually, this is the spear point of democracy. You could make a real argument for that. At least I see it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, in Myanmar right now, where the military government took power on February the 2nd, we've had a number of training courses in Myanmar over the years. We've trained, I think, 30 or 40 young journalists from there. One of the first things the government did, of course, is close down the newspapers, close down the television, close down the radio. It then turns off the internet. It then turns off the mobile phone network, so that people who are working and sneaking their pictures out can no longer do so. Of course, you'll never stop them, and the pictures still emerge. But that's one of the first things that totalitarian governments do. And in a country like America or in Great Britain, where that's not possible, they'll just undermine, the media that exists. Absolutely. And without access to good information, we as citizens can't make smart choices.
Yeah, and I think that also that totalitarian or authoritarian impulse is also very present, with certain media outlets like Fox News and some of the other Murdoch empire, in that they just cultivate, again, almost a religious and cultic following of people who will only get their information through this source and don't want to hear other voices, because that would challenge them, and they make sure they never do hear them. And that also seems to me to be part of the problem in this country, but other places as well.
Yes, also, monetizing the press, right? I think when you have, it's a sort of bit of anathema in the States. I know we have PBS and NPR, but I think, perhaps the greatest source of news in the world is the BBC, and the BBC belongs to the taxpayer.
Right.
It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the taxpayer. It belongs to the people. It's accountable to the people. And that's people of all stripes, right? The whole religious, ethnic, political spectrum. And I think that's really essential. And one of the problems that you have, not only in America, but worldwide, is at the moment is journalism driven by profit motive. And,
exactly. And bordering on entertainment to the point where you can't even watch a newscast. Now, Fiona, you must have an opinion of this. Back to the Peter Jennings day, I don't remember banner headlines strolling across the bottom of the screen the whole time, asking you to look at 10 other things and saying breaking story and so on. I mean, the whole thing is treated like a movie trailer now. It's not even news anymore.
Yeah, well, there's so much competition, and the revenue stream has become so fragmented, and that's where all of this has gone. It's everybody's looking for money, because actually, if you don't have the money, then you don't have the finance with which to make a quality product and to fund the. That's one of the big issues, and I always sort of think back to I blame Ronald Reagan for a lot of this, because it was under Reagan that the fairness in the media legislation was kicked out, and that required every network and every newspaper to give equal amount of time to every argument. So it would have been possible to have Fox News or MSNBC or to have an equal voice, and that comes back to trust. When you know that you're hearing two sides, you're forced to listen to two sides of the argument, then you know that somewhere in the middle you can make up your own mind. Whereas if you're force fed and you like what you're hearing from one place and not from another, then we all go to the place that we like because it makes us feel comfortable. But
you add in another element there, and that is the complete kind of destruction of the news business as we would think of it anyway. A whole generation of people that are just looking at their cell phone, and they aren't even in the news stream. It's not even that the local newspaper and not getting the fairness doctrine and two sides on network news. You're not even going to the news anymore. You're getting all this through, whatever the hot button deal of the moment is. It was Facebook a while ago. Now it's something else. So how does a journalist communicate into this environment? Your younger journalists coming through, they haven't even been raised in a news environment. They've been raised in these little social media bubbles in which people exist in kind of free from all facts that bother them, because the algorithms being written by Facebook are making sure you're only seeing things that are going to make you click again and again and again anyway. So it's an even further narrowing, very deliberate narrowing, keeping you all in your own little stream, feeding you what you want to hear. I mean, as a journalist, that must just be kind of shocking.
It is shocking, but it's not surprising, because it's been a drip effect for the past 20 years really. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why the initiatives that the 7 Academy are so important, because you really need journalists to be able to understand that journalism isn't opinion. That's something else that has its value.
Yeah.
Journalism, and journalism true journalism relies on two sources, two or more sources, fact checking, that you know, a natural cynicism, you know, questioning, not waiting to hear the answer you want and then thinking I've got it, but questioning why is that person saying what they are, and so it's a lot of training, I think. And I think
so. Fiona, if someone out there is watching this, and by the way, anybody watching, I'm Frank Schaeffer. You're on my Facebook page and other places that this will be posted. This is going to be recorded. So if you've missed part of this and come in late, it's all going to be available on my Facebook page and the other places I post things with Fiona talking about these issues in this book. But Fiona, just reiterate again how people who are interested in these topics and want to get in touch with you guys can do it, your Roman numeral 7 and so forth and so on. Just go through it one more time.
Yeah, okay, so just for anybody that's interested in getting hold of the book, you can get that through our website, reflectionsonpeace.org. It's also available on Amazon, Imagine Reflections on Peace. The website where that houses all of our activities is theviifoundation.org. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's the7foundation.org. And if you find that, then you'll find a route to the Academy and the Imagine website.
If you want to get in touch with me, you can do it here on Facebook or send me an email to frankschaeffer@aol.com, which you can find. But one thing I want to just end here about the book. You know, I have a lot of friends who come out of various backgrounds, political, otherwise, and they're all interested in peace initiatives, Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. I can just honestly look you guys in the face and say, listen, if you're putting together any kind of a program, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's something to do with women's rights, whether it is to do with the LGBTQ community and trans rights and these other things, and you want to deal with these issues of peace, reconciliation, community effort, and so forth, Imagine Reflections on Peace has got to be in your library. This is an expensive book, not because it's overpriced, but because it is actually an art book as well as a book of essays in terms of the quality of the printing of the photographs and so on. That said, you know, there's not a church library in a progressive church that does peace issues. There's not a group or an organization that should not have this sitting on the front desk and well leafed and marked up and read. It's incredibly informative. It's very easy to get through. It's not a big, heavy intellectual text. It's a quick read in all the different essays. But honestly, if I was teaching at a high school level or college level, anything to do with world history, peace initiatives, diplomacy, any of this stuff, you know, this ought to be on the desk of the guys doing foreign policy stuff at Georgetown, whatever it may be. This is a serious book and it made a huge impression on me, and you need to own it or make sure your organization does. And I sincerely mean that, or you really are out of the loop on this issue. This is really up to the moment stuff. So please get in touch with Gary and Fiona if you have an interest in journalism and photography and doing some of the democratizing they're talking about in real journalism. Let them help you get this book and get in touch with me or with them to follow up one way or another. So Gary, last word from you, something that you wanted to say all through this, but I was blabbing too much and didn't give you the moment. So just how would you like to wrap this up?
Well, one, I'd like to thank you, Frank. You know, it's been a wonderful experience for us, actually, and thank you for everybody who logged in. I think, perhaps the last word is something again I write in the introduction. You mentioned it when we started. Is I think when society can celebrate, you know, people who are trying to build communities and trying to create peaceful, prosperous societies, more than we can celebrate warriors, with no disrespect at all to warriors. I think we'll be in a better place, and I think we need to elevate people who are trying to bring us together.
Yeah, I agree. And Fiona, last thought from you, and that really will be the last thought, and then I'll bid you all adieu and off we go.
just to say thank you, Frank, for having us here. And this is a great opportunity. We hope that this book is going to get out there and people will discuss it and debate it as we have today. And so I'd like to hope that people get out and buy it.
Thank you. And listen, I admire both of you so much. We all talk about these issues. Once in a while, somebody stands up and does something, and you're two of those guys. So thank you for sticking up for democracy and for what's right and for journalism and for truth. I really admire you both. Thank you so much. We will let it go at that. This is Frank Schaeffer on my Facebook page. This has been recorded. It will be up and available and posted on all my, whatever it is, the hell this online presence is of mine. So thank you so much. We will go now. Thank you very much.